Three, one. Great Wednesday, and welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. And as we like to say, our goal today is to help discuss how to continue to explore ways to build fully human connections. So with that being said, how you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing well, King, and I always look forward to our conversation in the morning. So I'm happy to be here, and just can't complain.
Excellent. So what's your spiritual energy level today? From 0 being like sucks to 10 being life is awesome.
Yeah, so it's really 10. I mean, I'm going to start my day. Well, actually, I started my day 2.5 hours ago doing some work related to this, and I get to speak with you for an hour, which is great. And then tonight, I'm doing an in-person reading and conversation about what we're talking about at the Westport Writers Workshop in Westport, Connecticut. So it's actually going to be the first in-person gig talking about this the book that we're talking about. So I'm really kind of energized to do that because with COVID, I'm just getting back into getting into rooms with people. So this is a high energy day for me. Yeah.
Excellent.
And how about you?
I'm always at a 10. Like I said, the engineer in me always looks at putting things in a logical perspective, and I see no logic in choosing anything less than a 10. Because what I'm saying with that is that our numbers are what we are chosen, not based off what happens to us. Is how we choose what the numbers are, and I get no value saying I'm a 5 or a 6. There's no value, but being a 10, I see tremendous value in it. I feel it, and I just look forward to the infinite possibilities that today is going to provide. And which is an excellent segue into things I'm grateful for, my gratitude moment, which my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, run, and have sound mind. Another 24 hours to pursue my purpose in life, my mother who's alive and healthy and have sound mind. And I'm also grateful for a roof over my head. And as you know, learning from you, access to electricity, internet, food in the fridge, those things. And then finally, my problems that I face, my challenges that I have in my life, because through those solutions to the overcoming of those challenges, I become a better person and continue to build my path of learning myself and self-mastery.
Yeah, I almost don't want to say anything after that. That's a tough act to follow. So obviously, I mean that as I mean it sincerely. That's beautiful, and I'm joking about. I think I'm okay too. I'm just grateful for the really basic things that I think a lot of us take for granted. And I don't mean that to project that out to anybody else, but I'm just grateful that I have, I get to live in a house, which I rent. It has indoor plumbing and regular electricity. There's a refrigerator filled with food. So those kind of, physical benefits, the things that, we get to take advantage of are just wonderful. And then as with some of what you said, I'm in generally good health. My mind, as far as up until this moment as I'm speaking, seems to work reasonably well. I hope that'll keep on going well. I'm blessed with great friends. I'm as I say that you and I have only known each other for about 5 months, and I consider you a friend and colleague now. I'm really grateful for your presence in my life. And I'm blessed that way with friendships, professional and personal. And then just things that are beyond my control, but I look out the window today and I'm in the Northeast and it's going to get up into the mid 60s. There's not a cloud in the sky. It's a beautiful fall day in New England. And, not that I can blame the weather for my mood, but it's easier to be, clicking my heels when the weather is beautiful, although it's even when the weather is beautiful, if we need rain, which we did this summer, once in a while it's good to have those rain clouds, as our friends in the western part of this country really understand, because they've had they're in the middle of a 20-year drought. So I'm just grateful for all of that, and then and I get to do what I care deeply about for a living. I always have in little iterations, and over 40 plus years as someone in the workplace, I have more choice now, and I've really managed to narrow it down to limit the things I don't enjoy doing and enjoy, that I have passion about. So I'm really grateful for that as well.
Excellent, excellent. Love to start the morning off. Definitely every conversation with the gratitude moments, energy levels, because it just really frames the conversation in a very positive state, in a very progressive state, as far as with the intent to co-create and make something great happen. And with the book that you've written, congratulations, like I said, for the opportunity to have a live discussion tonight. So I'm happy for you. Seen some of your journey along this way, and I've been just really blessed and privileged to be able to share that journey with you, and wish you much success. And with that being said, let's kind of get into our topic today. So why don't you lead us into what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, thanks, King. And so again, for folks maybe joining us for the first time, the book is Healing America's Narratives, subtitle The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And there's a little tag right beneath that that says Becoming More Fully Human. And what we're going to talk about today, this idea of a collective national shadow, the part of an individual, if it were an individual we're talking about, or an organization, or even a nation, part of us that we disown or that we don't know we have. And when it's shadow, and this is shadow in the Jungian sense, we tend to project that part of ourselves onto others. So if I'm always angry, but I don't know that I'm always angry, I'll see a lot of angry people out there. He's angry and she's angry. Realize that I'm angry. So it's a part of myself that I don't see. And that can occur on a collective as well as with an organization or a nation. So in the book, I identify 9 aspects of our collective national shadow. I'll just name most of them right now. Typically, I don't have them in front of me, but I can usually get 8 of them, and I always forget one, so I don't know which one it is. But they're not comfortable to own. So ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, bullying, violence, greed, excess, and untrustworthiness. That's actually, I got all 9. Off camera, I was using my fingers to make sure I counted all 9. So I know I got them. But there are aspects of the country that we make believe we don't have, because we're America and we're not ignorant. Maybe we're arrogant, but all of those are really present and have been for the 2.5 centuries almost that we've been in existence. Not to say that the shadow is the only part of the country. There's good in this country, and you and I have spoken about that. But we're not going to be healthy as a nation, or as healthy as we might be, unless we own, recognize, and begin to integrate these shadow elements and maybe begin to correct them. To be less ignorant, to be less arrogant, to be, a big one is to be less violent. So that's where we are today. And then you and I, agreed that what we would do, and we really haven't gone to these chapters in the book yet in our conversations. Chapter 6 in the book addresses the Vietnam War, and chapter 7 addresses post 9/11, the post 9/11 war on terror, which is speaking specifically about Iraq and Afghanistan. And just want to kind of surface the presence of those 9 shadow elements from post World War II through Vietnam and then into the post 9/11 war on terror, because they're very, very present. And we can see when the words of first and then President Eisenhower, post World War II, and then the words of Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense in the early days of the Vietnam War, and who left the Johnson administration and was one of the few public officials in this country to ever write a book acknowledging the mistakes made. His book, In Retrospect, is a pretty powerful read. And then we'll take a look at the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, in a publication that came out in 2021. And what's notable and really disturbing in a lot of ways is that there's a trajectory beginning with Eisenhower, continuing through McNamara, and continuing through the Inspector General in Afghanistan reconstruction, a trajectory of they're saying the exact same things about why things went wrong. In other words, the lessons weren't learned over the course of whatever that is, 70 years or so. And that's frightening.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So would it be good if I just started with Eisenhower? Eisenhower spoke to 5 or 6, 5 precepts in 1946. So again, post World War II, and some of the things that he felt that we needed to learn as a country. So he said, basically, no people on earth can be held to be the enemy as a people, because all humanity shares the common hunger for peace and fellowship and justice. That was his first one. He said that no nation's security and well-being can be lastly achieved in isolation, but only in effective cooperation with other nations. And that's one of the reasons that the UN, for all of its blessings and curses, came into being. The third one is the right to form of government and economic system of its own choosing is inalienable. The fourth one is that any nation's attempt to dictate to other nations their form of government is indefensible. And the fifth one is a nation's hope of lasting peace cannot be firmly based upon any race in armaments, but rather upon just relations and honest understanding with all other nations. So I make the argument in the book that beginning almost immediately after Eisenhower spoke these out loud, the United States violated precepts 1, 3, 4, and 5, and continues to engage in a debate about number 2, which is the debate around isolationism versus effective cooperation with other nations. And we still have that debate, in our public sphere. So I'll just pause there for a moment just to put those 5 precepts out there. And anyone who knows even a little bit of history and hears those precepts can kind of see that, those were wonderfully spoken and iterated, but not really particularly embraced by our country's leaders, regardless of political party. Somebody might argue, well, the Democrats err more in this direction, the Republicans err more in this direction. But regardless, if you look at the trajectories from Vietnam through, and even take Korea into effect, but Vietnam through the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, it's been horrible. From the standpoint of those 5 precepts spoken by President Eisenhower.
Absolutely. And thank you definitely for sharing for that, because I think it definitely helps set the context of kind of where Eisenhower's vision for what he wanted the United States to go in and what he feared what it would go in, because he saw the writing on the wall. And I believe that's why again, I don't know that for a fact, but my interpretation is I believe that's why he said those things. So hopefully try to maybe warn us and deter us from going down those paths and give us something positive to really latch on. Now, my question would be for you within this context is, why do you think we chose to continue to go down the road that we have gone, which is to ignore those precepts and be about isolationism? And now my answer that I believe is still based on a system, the industrial military complex system, where we mistakenly believe it's much more profitable and much more in alignment with where we want to be as a nation, as far as off the ego and the power and the control, where isolationism based upon our terms, then we can look for collaboration. Once we've been recognized as the default leader, then we can collaborate within the context that we define. Then there's obviously collaboration. But I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that as well.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with what you just said. That systemic element is important, and that's kind of the infrastructure that holds all of these transgressions. So I agree with that. I want to add a couple of more pieces because, as you know, I have what I call a developmental bias. That there are levels of a development that adults can see the world through, and our shorthand in these conversations and mine in the book are this simple. My worldview is just about me, so I don't care about anybody else, and it's just whatever impacts me. Growth from that leads me to a worldview where it's about us. And that's actually the most problematic one in the 21st century because there's various us's out there, whether it's a nation, a religion, a political party. Right now between Houston and Philadelphia, there are baseball fans who have us things going on, in a more of a fun and less harmful way, and for the most part. But there are a lot of us's out there. But about us at its healthiest can be a really powerful, useful way to view the world because, we're in this together. Our group can do some good as long as it doesn't become us against them. The next stage of growth is it's about all of us, meaning all humans. So having a really human-centric view. So, I used to say back in the 80s and 90s when, dealing with the Middle East. So if a baby dies, it doesn't matter if the baby dies in Brooklyn or Baghdad. It's still a human child who's dead. And if you have a world-centric or a human-centric view, the death of a baby in Baghdad or Bermuda or, just going all B words now, Bakersfield, doesn't matter where it is, it's still a human death. And that's a really different viewpoint than if it's just about my people or my party or my country. And then the last one, where very few humans, really live nowadays, if any, it's about all that is. It's about the universe, creation. We care about the planet and everything that is, excuse me, internal and external. So I want to bring that back now, and I make the argument that, again, and this is, I believe, consistent with the systemic view that you're taking. If you look at the systems that were most influential when I'll do this really briefly, but I think it's important. When first the Spanish and Portuguese explorers turned colonizers arrived in the Caribbean, what we now call the Caribbean islands and Central and South America, the system was the Catholic Church and the monarchies in those countries. And they found peoples first in Africa before they got here, and then the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and what we now call the Americas. And the explorers, colonizers were ignorant of these different cultures. They assumed they were superior to these African and indigenous American cultures. And so they enslaved them, or just killed them, or just took their land. And they did that with the authority of the monarchy and the Catholic Church. So there's ignorance and arrogance manifesting in bigotry and violence way back then. So I won't give a lot of examples. And then the Anglican Church and the British did the same thing in North America, what we now call the United States, same basic trajectory. If we look at post-World War II and the power that America earned, because we had to mobilize for that war. We didn't, General George Marshall referred to the United States Army at the beginning of World War II as a third-rate military. When we got pulled into the war, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we didn't have a powerful standing army. So it was considered a third-rate military. So what ended up happening then was, we really contribute to saving both Europe and folks in Asia, and we surfaced as a superpower along with the Soviet Union. We went in a democratic direction; they went in a communist direction, and we began to fear the spread of communism around the world. And Vietnam was a kind of in some ways considered a tipping point, an important country. And we saw the Vietnamese people in our ignorance as inferior to us, in the same way we saw the Africans and the indigenous nations of the Americas as inferior. And we thought we'd go in there and, against everything that Eisenhower said, we're going to go in there and make sure they have an American-like democracy. And at least half of their country wasn't really looking for that. Some were, some weren't. Fast forward, post 9/11, beginning looking for the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, which I think any president would have done. Looking for the folks who orchestrated the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Centers. We then preemptively, just because we could, went into Iraq, who had nothing to do with 9/11, because some people didn't like Saddam Hussein. And then we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, again, thinking that we had the best way to live and trying to insert American democracy and capitalism in two cultures, especially the Afghan culture, which were so different from ours that what we tried to give them, they didn't understand or agree with. Ignorance of their cultures, arrogance on our part, again, perpetrated through violence. So, I mean, those are pretty straightforward links that I think anyone would be hard pressed to refute. Now, you can interpret the historical events any way we want, but those historical events took place. And my argument is that, those are all elements of our shadow, all evidence of that ignorance, arrogance, showing up in bullying and violence, and very often exacerbated by greed. Because every time we go to war, a very small number of people in the United States get very rich. Because they build ships, they build jets, they build guns, they build bullets, and then they rebuild what we bomb. So there's a whole industry, and you refer to Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. There's a whole industry around war, and it's a powerful industry. So it's a very complex chain of events, I believe, of a larger system where the church isn't as powerful, but the church is now, people can argue with this, it's kind of the corporate America is the church that really has a relationship with the government. And there's money to be made when in keeping the military, the highest annual spending in our national budget. So all of that is intertwined there. But we look at those who are different from us, from the earliest days of the explorers into the Americas, before there was a United States, rather than, a different culture. What can we learn through a cultural exchange? Our ancestors, English, Portuguese, Spanish, and French ancestors basically said, a different culture, we're superior. We have God on our side. They don't really have a God the way we do, so we can enslave them and take their land. That's not 100% different from what went on in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Now, it's not identical, but the underlying themes are still there. So I'll take a breath.
Yes, absolutely. But what I was coming away with what you said, number one, two key things I want to point out. Number one, you said that the I as an individual, then we move into the us, then us versus them, but very few of us operate in the collective of we tap into the universe and it's a greater we with a concern for the planet and everything that's living in that planet. Now, I know me personally, that's the path I'm on, right? I haven't reached that, but I'm clear that that's my journey. And so what I advocate is that our education systems, our spiritual systems should be geared towards that type of teaching and education, so that that's where we aspire to be, so that we have curriculum, we have workshops, we have exercises, we have activities that's based into that kind of alignment, that we move towards that. So the older you get, the closer you obviously should be there. And then we learn from the wisdom of the elders of why they didn't get there, and then we can correct along the way. Now, what's interesting is that we've chosen not to. We've chosen to go into a system that's really predicated, as you say, on ego. And you talk about the 9 elements of the shadow. So my question now, part 2 now with that context, would be going back to the discussion of the masculine versus the feminine energy. Are those 9 elements you laid out, would that all be constituted under the masculine energy, or does that fit into some of the feminine energy as well? Or what are those energies fitting along with those 9 elements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we've discussed that before. So my understanding of those 9 elements is there can be either healthy or unhealthy masculine or feminine. So in other words, and we're not speaking about men and women here, we're speaking about the energetic components. And I know you know that. So ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, violence, greed, those can manifest through the unhealthy feminine or the unhealthy masculine. Historically, in this country, based on what I've read, seen, and lived, they have primarily, if not exclusively, manifested through a dominant the masculine, that which is individual based, that which is, cares more about the idea of justice than mercy, more about wisdom, even what I would say is mistaken wisdom. Again, the earliest explorers, who were not uneducated, believed that their Christian faith was superior to any spiritual, cultural beliefs that the Africans that they kidnapped had, and to any of the spiritual, cultural beliefs that the Native Americans have. When I say Native Americans, I mean across North, Central, and South America, so all of that. But we're focusing specifically on North America with the United States. So it's not. It's one can have unhealthy feminine energy. We don't talk a lot about it in the book because it's not the problem in the book. The problem in the book is the unhealthy masculine, but that would manifest. To be unhealthy feminine would be to lose a sense of individuation, lose a sense of self, and become codependent with another. Because as the healthy feminine is more about relationship and embrace, an unhealthy version of is going too deep into relationship and lose self in codependence and another. That's just one example of it. But in terms of our history and our current events, what I see primarily prevalence of a dominant masculine energy, and again, that can appear in both men and women. And I think there's plenty of evidence of it in the public sphere in both genders. So I don't know if did I get to the heart of your question? I'm not sure if I did.
No, you did. You answered the question by saying that it's not those 9 shadow elements, not exclusively linked to either one, but both can have elements and attributes where those 9 elements fit into that. So yeah, that answered my question. Yeah. As we move along, I wanted to talk about how because you were laying out the foundation of how we didn't learn from those lessons. So you had a second reading that continued along that lines of not really having an understanding.
Yeah. So just to take that a step further. So, we heard Eisenhower's precepts about, well, I'm not going to count the years here, but I mean, about 50 years later, 40 to 50 years later, Robert McNamara, again, Secretary of Defense, first for John Kennedy and then for Lyndon Johnson, who left the Johnson administration because he began to see, in his own mind and heart that the war was wrong. Again, he was an architect of that war, someone who promoted it, but he began to, as you and I would say, he began to evolve, to grow. His view changed. So he came up with 11 lessons learned. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to just mention a couple of them. And you can hear the similarities to what Eisenhower had said post-World War II. So this is from McNamara's book, In Retrospect, which came out in 1995. So he said, we misjudged then, meaning at the beginning of the Vietnam War, as we have since, the geopolitical intentions of our adversaries. We exaggerated the dangers to the United States of our political adversaries' actions. So we didn't get what was really going on, is what he said. We didn't understand it. The second one is really powerful. We viewed the people and leaders of South Vietnam in terms of our own experience. So think back to what we just said about the Portuguese, Spanish, French, English explorers, colonizers. They viewed the Africans and then the indigenous peoples of the Americas in terms of their European experience. They judged them based on that. So really consistent mistake. And then number 4, this is the last one I'll read. There's 11 of them now. I just want to get the taste of it here. He wrote, our misjudgments of friend, meaning the South Vietnamese, and foe alike, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. So our misjudgments of both friend and foe, quote, reflected our profound ignorance of the history, culture, and politics of the people in the area and the personalities of their leaders. So, when that came out in 95, people were really angry. Some people were able to be both angry and, deeply bow in respect for McNamara to have the courage to write those things, again, as one of the people who was ignorant of the cultures in Vietnam at the time he was as Secretary of Defense. So it was a really powerful series of statements, which if anyone had looked at Eisenhower's precepts seriously prior to our putting combat troops on the ground and beginning the bombing in Vietnam, maybe we would have, I don't know, maybe we would have second thoughts. Maybe we wouldn't have gone in. Maybe, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe nothing would have happened. But the clear consistency of ignorance, arrogance, and he even said we were ignorant of both our friends and our foes. And, the same thing played out, as we'll see when we get to the Special Inspector General of Afghan Reconstruction, because the same basic things were said there. So I'll put a pause button there. Ongoing ignorance, not learning the lessons that were given in public to learn.
Absolutely. And since we're kind of in that McNamara time frame right now, I want to share with our listening audience what I believe a quote from Bobby Kennedy that really encapsulates what you're actually laying out. And he says, few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of society. Moral courage is a rare commodity in bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential vital quality for those who seek to change a world which yields most painfully to change. And I mentioned that quote mainly because, again, I'm always going to go back to the systems again. And see, that's where I believe that the reason I stay there is because I'm always going to come back to that point, because I believe that then throughout history and even now, we have a tendency to always talk about the leaders individually, and because we don't talk about the system never changes. And we mistakenly believe that if we choose a different leader, but still operate within the system, we're going to get a different output.
Yeah.
And we're not, and I say this, whether it's changing the leader's color of their skin, changing the leader's gender, changing the leader's sexual orientation. We think that's making progress, but that leader still holds true to the systematic understanding and adherence to the greater all system. We're going to still get the same output regardless. Right. And that's where the hopelessness comes in. And that's where I begin to see where we're shifting into nowadays, where we have the same problems, I believe, that we had in the past. It just comes at us differently. It's like the foods that we eat. We may still eat cow, but we don't prepare it the same way that we've come up with technology in different ways for our generations to prepare it differently, but it's still cow. We're still eating red meat, and I'm just using it as an analogy or an example. And so that's what I really want folks to really begin to examine critically, the systems that your beliefs in these systems and your understanding of these systems. And as you begin to question that, then I believe that's going to lead to the higher understanding of, let me get more in alignment with the true path of becoming fully human that we talked about before, as you mentioned on the cover of your book. And that needs to be the quest. of how do I become fully human once I have this understanding of our history, right? Like leading to the war on terror, and you're going to talk about that in a second as well. It's in my mind, it's always been a war on terror in a context. Now, not by the definition of what we define as a war on terror, but what I'm saying is if you understand the definition of what terror is and you understand the definition of what war is, there's always been a war on terror, the terrors of our minds individually and our collective senses. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as we continue our discussion.
Yeah, no, I love that. In fact, I just want to comment quickly on the last piece you said, but the idea of a war on terror, because back in the late 40s through the 50s and into the 60s, the terror was the domino theory in Southeast Asia. If we don't do something there, because the Soviet Union post World War II was also a superpower, and they want to spread communism, we want to spread democracy. And the terror was if we don't intervene, communism will spread throughout Southeast Asia. So I agree with you 100% there. And with regard to the system piece, one of the things I've been shifting my language in the last couple of weeks as I'm learning about how to speak about the book, that I really realize that, there are places I get my news from, several, multiple, because I want to, just make sure I'm getting as accurate reports as I can about what's really true. I don't listen to a lot of news commentary because I can pretty much understand reporting, from real journalists myself. I don't need to tell me what the news means. But occasionally I will listen. But what's really clear to me, and this is not good news from where I'm sitting, but I think it's important news, is that those elected officials with whom I generally agree, and I don't always agree with the people I vote for, but generally I agree. That's why I make my choices and I vote. So the elected officials for whom I will vote next Tuesday, and then again in 2024, whoever they happen to be then, and the elected officials who I would never vote for because their worldview is very different from mine, and all of the news commentators, what I like to refer to as the performance news commenters, people who have made talking about the news a performance. I don't want to say art because it's really not art. All of them, those I agree with, those I disagree with, all of them are at the effect of our national shadow. They're in other words, they're operating, to use your language, within a system, and they're just slinging rocks and clumps of mud and grass and sticks back and forth on social media and on conventional media, but they're doing it within the same systemic, with the same system, with the same infrastructure. And so I agree with you 100%. One place I probably disagree a little bit, I think there is a little bit of progress made. There is some kind of progress made when we do get, a woman or a person of color in a certain place where there never has been a woman or a person of color before, or a person of, who's other than, this is a horrible way to say it, but other than heterosexual cisgender. That's so I apologize for doing it in the reverse like that. But I agree with you that they're still there. President Obama, first Black president, still operated within the same system and was constrained by it. As will anybody be, because the system is really powerful. It's been in place for a long time, and no one person, even if they can take a little chisel and hammer and make a mark on the system, really changes it a whole lot. So I agree that all of the prospective leaders, corporate leaders, government leaders, media leaders, which are media leaders are corporate leaders, they're all at the effect of things either that they're aware of that they don't care about, or things they're just not aware of. So I agree with you on that. And for me, that's the most frightening part of the conversation. Because making a dent in it is, as you said, I love your argument. And most of us are going to be voting on very, very local issues next Tuesday. There's some U.S. Congress seats and Senate seats up for grabs, and those get all the headlines. But where the change can really take place is locally first. So I love that you come back to that on a regular basis in our conversations. I didn't mean to steal that from you, but
No, I don't look at it as stuff, because see, again, I own it, that I control it, and you have to adhere to it being mine. But and kind of piggyback on what you said, and mainly because of what's happening next Tuesday is why I want to really talk about this, not to make this a political show, but going back to my point, and that's why I think that when people look at with the Democrats, and again, I'm not pushing one particular party and not just analysis. You look at what the Democrats are really saying. They're for justice, so to speak. They're for minimum wage. They're for making sure everything is equal. They're making sure that everybody is inclusive. That's what they're saying. But then yet and still, their candidates struggle to actually win against candidates who are speaking the opposite. The Republicans are not speaking inclusion and diversity. They're speaking nationalism for the most part. They're speaking fear for the most part. Democrats are speaking fear on the other end of what if the Republicans get in party, what they're going to do and what rights you're going to lose and what privileges you're going to lose and how they're going to push the clock back, that kind of fear. Republicans are more pushing crime and things of that nature. And where I'm going with my point is this, that again, because of the system where, and that's why I think that the Republicans are gaining and maybe might win a lot of the election seats, whether it's a House or governor races across the country, is because they're candidates that are of the mega ideology are speaking anti-system. So that's why I believe Trump was such an appeal to people, and it still is because Trump came out and, just give you an example what I mean by that. Every president or any candidates running for president, once they've been nominated by their particular party, they have to disclose or they agree to disclose their tax records to say, here's what my income has been for the past 3 years, here's how much I make, here's my income sources, etc. Again, not the law, but that's just been the kind of the part of the process where Trump just came out and said, no, I'm not going to do that. And, that shows defiance in the system. Now, again, that's to his betterment, but people saw that as, there's a change there. There's a different way this man is operating. He's not going to come along and just play by the same rules. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, to the point where you have, again, in Georgia, another example, where Georgia has historically been a red state, if you want to put them in some kind of category, red meaning Republican state, and then Democrat is switched to the last side. They're willing now to put another black man in office, where I never would have thought that Republicans would stand behind a black person, but they stand behind this kind of black person, being Herschel Walker, and he's the worst type of image that a black person that any other self-respecting black man would look at. He's not a positive father figure. He's an absentee father. He's a hypocrite. He's a liar on a lot of things. And I'm not saying that as a judgment. I'm saying those are the facts about him, right? I mean, it's just coming from his own kids, not me, just from outside context. This is the person that they're willing to put in office because he still seems anti-system. That's his appeal. It's like, okay, I want to deal with all the hypocrisy and all the other issues that this man has because he's going to come in and more likely change the system that the Democrats seem to be saying. And that's where I'm saying the Democrats' message is never changing the system. Their message is we want to be more inclusive within the system and bring more people into the system as opposed to change the system. And that's why I see that that's going to be the issue for why the Republicans, if they do win, as many polls are actually indicating, that's going to be the reason why. And the Democrats, to me, just don't get it, which for me shows me that either A, you're just being ignorant, or B, you are really functioning within the system, and that's your role. It's to create this kind of confusion, so to speak, so that we're left with that dichotomy of hypocrites, liars on one side, or liars and hypocrites in a different direction on another side. So at the end of the day, that's where I'm going with, is why you're going to always hear me say that. But I know that one more, you wanted to read from one more chapter, and I want to make sure we we kind of get to that part before we run out of time.
Yeah.
That really talked about the war on terror, because you showed a timeline of how we did not really learn anything from what Eisenhower laid out.
Yeah. So the last piece comes from a 2021 report entitled "What We Need to Learn: Lessons from 20 and Reconstruction," August 2021, and it comes from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, and it's available online. Like all of these documents, you can actually find this full report just searching for it online, and it comes up. It's a PDF. You can download it. It's public knowledge, so it's nothing. I didn't have to dig real hard to get a hold of this, and they came up with, there are 7 chapters in this report, and it talks about where the government, based on the Inspector General's review, where the government came up short. I'm going to read number 6 first, because it's really the most consistent one for all of what Eisenhower said and what McNamara said. Number 6, the header is context. The U.S. government did not understand the Afghan context and therefore failed to tailor its efforts accordingly. So that's just, that in itself would be enough. Didn't understand the country, the context of Afghanistan. A couple of the other ones these are just one sentence kind of tags at the beginning of each chapter. Number 1 is strategy. The U.S. government continuously struggled to develop and implement a coherent strategy for what it hoped to achieve. Keeping in mind again that the Bush administration went into Afghanistan, in October of 2001, left the government when Barack Obama got, elected for the first time in 2008. Obama's administration with the special forces killed Osama bin Laden, the architect, the mastermind, if not the architect, of the September 11th attacks. And then we stayed in Afghanistan, even after we had accomplished that, for another years, get out in 2021. The third one, sustainability. Many of the institutions and infrastructure projects the United States built were not sustainable. Insecurity, persistent insecurity severely undermined Reconstruction efforts. And then number 7, and this is the last one I'll read, is the U.S. government agencies rarely conducted sufficient monitoring and evaluation to understand the impact of their efforts. And there's stats on what it cost. It's trillions. It's trillions of dollars, not billions. And so it's just really, you could just look at it from an economic standpoint. And I'm smiling as I say this, but that's a smile of frustration and incredulity, not humor. What else we could have done in the United States, and even in international policy, with the trillions of dollars spent there to defense contractors, to support the military and other things, which ended up getting nothing done. The Taliban, who, Donald Rumsfeld could have made an agreement with the Taliban in 2001, 2002. They were ready to say, all we want is to not be killed, but we'll agree to almost anything. And Rumsfeld said, we're not inclined to enter into a surrender agreement with you. So they never did it. So Trump ended up entering into an agreement with the Taliban in 2019, 2020, and Biden enforced that agreement in terms of withdrawing the troops, and it was horrible, when the actual manifestation of it. So it was, across political parties, Republican, Democrat, it was a mess. And we didn't learn anything. It seems that we just have not learned from Eisenhower forward, at the cost of millions of lives, mostly not American. Americans are in the thousands, but Vietnamese, Afghan, Iraqi, millions of lives, trillions of dollars. And are we safer and more stable in any real way? I'm not sure. I think locally, I would say in New York City, FBI and police department and anti-terrorism task force in that city has done kind of an astonishing job keeping things generally safe and being on top of things. But because they were the victims of the primary part of the attack, and were really motivated. But nationally, I'm sure the agencies speak to each other now the way they didn't prior to 9/11. They speak to each other more. But the world at large in the Middle East is not particularly a better place, I don't think, based on our intervention and expenditures.
And I tend to concur with that. I tend to agree with you. We're getting to the top of the hour, and we want to make sure that we leave folks with some positive directions and some guidance on how they can understand this information and begin to apply it to move toward becoming more fully human. So what do you see as what steps can people take now to begin to really put themselves on that path?
Yeah, so really practical steps. And again, this is just going to be some bullet points that call for a more in-depth exploration, which we'll do in future conversations. But first, be an exemplar for the world you want to live in. That's paraphrasing Gandhi. Be the change you want to see. So be an exemplar for the world you want to live in. Whether you lean Republican or Democrat, or you're unaffiliated voter, which I am, spend your time constructively promoting the quality of the world you want to live in by being an exemplar, and don't spend any of your time on social media or anywhere else screaming and yelling at the people you disagree with. Stop doing that. Just because that just doesn't serve anybody, and that's the status quo. Politicians are on Twitter, social media. Twitter is social media. Politicians, journalists are all on social media, screaming at each other. Stop doing that. That's the first step. But the biggest thing any one of us can do is be an exemplar for the world you want to live in, and underlying the world that I think the best of us, back to Lincoln's, the better angels of our nature, want to live in. It's grounded in love. And we can say more about that at a future date. But it's not about the hate and finger pointing and not saying agree with people who are doing harm to other people. I'm not saying advocate for that, but advocate for a way of being that's grounded in love and respect and care for all humans, and not just throwing rocks at the people you disagree with. That's my shorthand for how the last two chapters of the book address that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing. I think those are some powerful takeaways and some lessons. I think the first one, that you could be exemplar for the world that you want to see that's just and made of love. I like to quote Og Mandino when he says, "Do all things with love." And I believe, the movement I'm advocating now is really on the basis of spiritual capitalism. And I think that, some people would push back and say capitalism is something that needs to be changed. I disagree with that. I would believe that capitalism is something that definitely has its value, but it needs to be, again, a new system built around capitalism, which is spiritual capitalism. I just wanted to share on to that point, the very first, there's 10 commandments of capitalism, spiritual capitalism, that was written by the book Spiritual Capitalism by Michael E. Hendren. And just the first one is business is a spiritual experience. So to your point, when you say I'm making life more exemplar for yourself and for the world, that takes that mindset, puts in that context that I'm in business to make the world a better place. And I'm gonna go through a spiritual journey as a result of this. I'm not in business just to make money. I'm in a business to create value and make a difference. Yeah. And that's the path I'm on, and that's what I advocate. And as we talk about, which we're going to do in the very last section, is who is a person this week that we want to lift up to say exemplifies the fully human characteristics and behaviors that we're advocating, and again, I'll always choose people, to me, who chose to fight injustice, and it took a toll on them, and they didn't care about the consequences or the ramifications of their actions, because it was done in love. And to quote Castro, history absolved them. When he said history will absolve him for his actions. And whether you agree it did or not, I love that statement, because when you saying I'm doing things that you don't understand right now, but in time it would become clear why I'm doing these things, because the world would be better. That's what's most important. And so with that being said, so Reggie, who do you see, or who would you like to choose this week as your person who exemplifies the fully human connections?
Yeah, I think I may have mentioned this person once before, because I don't write these down, but he deserves. If I said him every week, I think he deserves it anyway. But the late Congressman John Lewis, who literally, to use the words you just used, literally on a regular basis put his life, his physical body on the line for what he believed in, and he was really clear that what he was doing that for was what he referred to as, I forget the originator of this phrase. He's an American philosopher, but I'll have to let that go for now. But in the name of the beloved community, that's what he wanted. In other words, the brotherhood or sisterhood, the community of all people, and he literally put his life on the line for that, and was almost killed, having his head cracked open more than once, and then just stayed with it, and died as a member of the United States Congress. And Nancy Pelosi referred to him as the conscience of the U.S. Congress because of his persistence, and is my exemplar.
Excellent. And I think that's always, we choose excellent choices. And again, the reason we do this, folks, is for you to understand, as we have this discussion, that there are people who exemplify these characteristics. So we're not just speaking in pure hypothetical, that folks have done this, and we're advocating that we continue to seek those by having these conversations and being open to these discussions. I would say that my choice this week would be Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. And what was unique about Fred was the fact that Fred was a visionary, and he saw the importance of connecting and co-creating, and what you talked about before, collaborating with others that was just not of his us mindset, not just Black people, but he reached out to Native Americans, he reached out to poor whites, he reached out to the Latin community, and began to really advocate the importance of unifying. And that's why I believe he was killed much faster, is because they saw the danger in that, as opposed to him just saying, I'm only going to advocate for Black rights and Black people's justice. He saw that any injustice anywhere was an injustice everywhere. And so again, someone who took a stance, who didn't allow himself to just point the finger, but actually took action. And as a result, it caused him either physical harm, in his case, his death, but it can come financial, it can come with your relationship. I mean, it can come with your actual image or brand that the world has of you. All those things are at risk when you decide to become fully human and fight against injustice and fight for justice in that context, but use the wisdom to make sure that there's empathy and love in that, and that you want to make sure that people benefit from it. So with that being said, Reggie, we reached the top of our hour. Again, this has been another great show, another great discussion. Again, I definitely want to thank you for taking the action, as I said before, and writing a book. I mean, the book was definitely a first step. The sacrifices you made, the time, there's a lot of things you could have done, but you chose to put this information out there. And I believe this information, now that's out in the universe, that's why we want to put forth an effort to discuss it and hopefully lead more people to reading about history, so we can better understand why the present is the way it is, and the importance of why we need to look for ways to stop pointing and blaming individuals for their behaviors, but really point to the system, because that's where the change is going to be. And until we recognize that, we're going to continue to receive the same output. As they say, the same soup warmed over. We might change the soup, but it's still going to be a soup that's constantly warmed over repeatedly, that we're constantly eating. So that's my final thoughts on our show today.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you, listening audience, for listening to another episode, of the Human Connections podcast. Until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., everyone continue to look for ways to adhere to what Reggie laid out as ways that we can begin to build that path. And that's our practice on being more fully human and making those connections. Thank you all.